I'm glad it's cold and it's raining today.
Hello everyone. So sorry for all of the delay. We had quite a few technical difficulties. Thank you all for coming to join us tonight for our event with Chief Boykin and Paul Henderson. Just a quick intro before we get started. Paul Henderson is a nationally recognized speaker, veteran prosecutor, and champion for social justice. Henderson has spent his entire professional career working in public service for the city of San Francisco, and most recently was appointed director of the Department of Police Accountability, where he and his legal team are tasked with investigating all complaints regarding police use of force and misconduct. Chief Boykin is a CNN political commentator, New York Times bestselling author, and a former White House aide to President Bill Clinton. Boykin teaches at the Institute for Research in African American Studies at Columbia University in New York, and previously taught at American University in Washington, D.C. He is a co-founder and first board president of the National Black Justice Coalition. A graduate of Dartmouth College and Harvard Law School, Boykin is a Lambda Literary Award-winning author of 4 books, his latest being Race Against Time. He lives in New York City. Enjoy the reading, everyone.
Thank you.
Right. Well, otherwise it's all going to be all right. Well, thank you guys for being here, and thank you, Keith, for being here. This is a real honor and a great conversation. I'm super excited to talk about these things in your book. And I'll just say, just to start off, I just finished the book this week, and I am a voracious reader. I read a lot. And my impressions from the book, I found it both didactic but really revelatory. And I just want to explain that. Because for me, I do a little commentary as well. I'm really familiar with a lot of the politics and a lot of the policies that you talk about in the book. But I found it really very interesting for me to relive some of the things that I had compartmentalized, that I had put away, that I hadn't analyzed in the way that you had presented them in the book, that made me look at the things that I thought I already knew in a new way and learn from that. It was really a big deal for me. I do read a lot, and I thought that I knew a lot, and I feel like even with what I thought I knew, I know more now because of having read the book and because of hearing your analysis. I'm curious if that was your intent in writing the book, or that speaks to what the expected outcome was from someone to pick up this book.
That's a great question, and it also speaks to the different audiences too, because I tried to create a book that would be accessible to multiple audiences. You, of course, know a lot about politics and law and race and all the things in the book, so you're a much more difficult audience to reach. And so I tried to reach sort of the professional class audience by telling inside stories about what was going on in Washington, my experience, things that people didn't necessarily know about, and to sort of pull back the curtain, if you will, and expose some of what was going on, but also to add a perspective to things. And the book is about race and politics, and I've worked in politics and race issues for most of my adult life and career, and sometimes when you're in the middle of things, you don't really fully appreciate what's going on around you. And I think that the best example I can think of was with the Clinton administration. And I worked in the Clinton administration, and I had never really thought about or processed what happened during that time until recently, just last year when I started working on that chapter in the book. And it really made me sort of reflect differently about what took place. On the other hand, there's the broader audience, which is the overwhelming majority of the American public, who don't know the ins ins and outs and the minutia of politics. And so I wanted to make it accessible to them too, so the people who don't know a lot about politics or race can still sort of open the book. You don't have to have a political science degree, or you don't have to be a lawyer to understand it, just to write in a way that would be accessible to as many people as possible.
And did you feel like in how you wrote the book or structured the book was different in the way that you prepare for like your commentary when you're on air, and if so, how?
Yes. Well, my mom is always complaining to me. Well, whenever I'm on CNN or on TV, my mom always has two comments. First, she comments on what I'm wearing and how I look. If I don't look healthy, she'll tell me, or if I'm not wearing the right color or something, she'll tell me that. But secondly, she'll also tell me if I'm speaking too quickly, which she says I do often, or if I'm speaking about things that she doesn't understand. Because I'm speaking usually I'm on air, I'm talking to someone like you, and we're having this inside the Beltway type of conversation. Right. We all know the language. We're talking about HR 6422 or something like that, and people don't know what that is, and we forget sometimes that there's a whole audience of people watching who don't necessarily have that familiarity. And so I had to sort of remind myself to be conscious about those things.
I would say there were several times during the book where I paused and felt, and I don't know if maybe it's because you teach or you present a lot, where I actively felt in the book that you were explaining things to me that I thought I understood, but I was understanding differently because of how you were presenting them. And in case your points were lost on me, you went back and explained the connection, explained the thoughts specifically to follow where you were going in your thoughts. I thought it was really well done. I prefer a didactic experience when I'm reading, and I thought it was really well done, almost from an academic perspective, without it feeling to me like I was in a classroom, or without me feeling like I had picked up a textbook to read, which I thought was done really well. And I had at least 3 of those moments while I was reading the book, which is why I asked the question if that was your intention, or you're
I wish I knew which moments you're referring to, but I think part of it is because I'm biased because I was trained to write as a journalist first. And in journalism, although I can't say this is always true for journalism today, but the way I was taught in journalism was to communicate information as succinctly as possible. And the way that I was taught to write in academia was exactly the opposite way. To write as indistinguishably, as complexly, as the most difficult way possible. And so I always felt there was sort of a balancing act. How do you take complex ideas and break them down and explain them to people so they don't feel overwhelming or difficult to understand? And I think that's been my big challenge, even as an academic in teaching students who are smart students, but some of the way that we communicate in academia is inaccessible, and I try to make it as accessible as I can.
I would say that was successful. I'll just tell you a couple of the areas that I found in the book that I thought were that. Your use of statistics and facts. I'm a lawyer. I like statistics. I like facts. People are entitled to their opinion, but you don't get to move away from these census numbers. You don't get to move away from Supreme Court rulings. You don't get to move away from what people actually did, not what they said, what they did. And those were the moments that I felt, as a good lawyer does, you support your arguments, but those moments soared to me in terms of understanding and validating the thoughts that you were projecting.
Well, it's very interesting you say that because, first of all, I have a very weird memory in that I can remember things that I shouldn't remember, and I can't remember things that I should remember. So I can remember, for example, the Supreme Court decision in 1883, civil rights cases, which struck down the civil rights law from 1875, and Justice Joseph Bradley's opinion. I can remember the dissenting opinions in that. And yet I can't remember what I had for breakfast today, or I can't remember people's names sometimes and things like that. And it's the weirdest thing. Like I can remember the details, the granular details of some things, and I can just sort of recall those and use those in the book. The problem with that is that it requires a lot of fact checking. So I wrote a lot just from memory, then I had to go back and fact check some things. And one of the things I did notice is that most of the factual information that I introduced in the book was correct, based on my memory. But a lot of the sort of life experiences were not. So I tell a story in the book about being at Harvard Law School. And I was a first-year student in Harvard Law School when there's a big protest movement for diversity on campus. And I told the story in the book of chasing the dean of the law school across the campus. And I remember that experience very vividly, in part because the photo of me chasing the dean appeared in the paper the next day in the Boston Globe. But I didn't remember how it ended. And so I can't even remember actually what I wrote in the book. But I discovered after I wrote the first draft of the book, I found an article from that. I found the actual original article from that day in the newspaper and discovered that my memory was incorrect about what happened at the end. At the end of my recollection, after we chased the dean to the administration building, they locked the door, we couldn't get in. The reality was we actually went in and we had a sit-in, and I don't know how I forgot the sit-in part of that. But I knew we had sit-ins, but I didn't know it was associated with that same story. So I can't remember even if I put that in the book or not.
You did.
Okay.
You did. And I will just say that those moments, the narratives that you weave in of your personal experiences tie to the background of these movements, which ties into the background of the overall theme of disparity and race and politics for the book, were the moments in which I thought the book soared. When your unpacking of those narratives tied in with your argument presentation was connected to the specific facts that you presented. That, to me, were some of the real highlights of the book that really emphasized some of the points that you were trying to make for me. And which leads me to my next question, because it leads us to some of the stuff that I thought was most interesting in the book, where you talked about the things that many of us were familiar with, but your book gives us a different lens about what was going on with 2020. And I don't think anyone in this country doesn't have a feeling or an opinion about what was going on in 2020 in a really personal way, but also in a way that's reflective of things that were going on in society for a number of reasons. And you talk about some of those reasons, the four big reasons, the things that all kind of converged in 2020. I think people experienced, but hadn't been able to put a title on it, or hadn't been able to articulate what those things were. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that was one of the moments that I paused with the book to be, they were things that I knew, but hadn't realized.
Wow. Well, 2020 was a very traumatic year for most of us, and I think we're still suffering the consequences of that. I saw a report yesterday, a news alert that yesterday or the day before, about the crime rate in 2020 had skyrocketed or something. We should know all about that. And I think that one of the things that we didn't take into consideration in sort of processing 2020, even where we are in 2021, is the traumatic effect, the mental health impact of the crises that we endured as a country. The fact that we had 4 cataclysmic crises that took place at the same time. I called them 4 gigantic tectonic plates shifting at the same time in our country. The first was, of course, the COVID pandemic, which was the worst pandemic in our country since the Great Flu epidemic of 1918. The second was the economic crisis, which was the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression of 1929. The third was the racial justice crisis, which started really with the murder of George Floyd, and that was the worst, I wouldn't use the word worst, but the largest racial justice movement in our country's history since the 1960s. And then the fourth, of course, was the crisis of democracy, which was generated by our former president, leading to the insurrection. And that was the most dramatic and pivotal point of democratic unrest in our country since the disputed election of 1876 that put Rutherford B. Hayes in office, even though he lost the popular vote to Samuel J. Tilden, and ended Reconstruction. So it was just this unusual convergence of 4 different crises happening at one time. And we were living through it every day. We were wearing a mask, as we still are. We were social distancing, as we still are. We were stuck in our homes, as many of us still are. We were unable to do some of the normal things that we do in our lives. And that was having a mental health impact on us. It had an impact on me. I lived for 3 months with my mom last year. My mom lives in Texas. I live in New York City. But I was in Los Angeles the week before the sort of COVID shutdown happened. And as soon as I left Los Angeles, I went to visit my mom. Her husband died the day after I arrived. And the country shut down 2 days later. And I ended up staying with my mom for 3 months. Wasn't planning on staying with her for 3 months, but you know, she was a widow. She suddenly became a widow all of a sudden, and I was there. I couldn't go back to New York City because there was so much going on there, and I didn't really even have a chance to process what did that mean for me to have to go through all that until I started writing this book and thinking about, well, what were we all experiencing last year? So that's kind of what I was trying to accomplish by sharing those stories, sharing personal experience, and putting 2020 into a perspective. I even talk about Kobe Bryant stuff and how that impacted me because of my own sort of personal connection to Kobe Bryant, which I discuss in the book. And it just, when you think about all the things that happened, it's just amazing.
And let me just tell you, because your personal narrative, I think what stood out was the personal narrative that you said as you were experiencing all of those factors mirrored the personal experiences that we all have. We all have a story about shifting our day-to-day operations because of one or all of those factors throughout 2020, and hearing you articulate it in the book and tie it to a theory about why all of these things were important, to me, it felt more like a burden being removed of clarity to be able to see all of those things that even though I had experienced them, was unaware of them.
Right.
You know, I mean, and obviously everyone can talk about one of those 4 things or all of those 4 things, but hadn't really connected them in the way that your book did to make it clear on how this was happening at the same time, how it affected your life, and then a lens on how to approach those issues individually and collectively. I thought was important with the woven narrative and the lens of race and race disparities. And so if I get you to talk a little bit about the impact of those things with the lens of race, I thought that was really significant.
Yes, well, about those 4 crises in 2020,
Yeah,
the general themes of the book in general. Okay.
Either or both.
Okay. Well, for the 4 you heard me talk about it. Paul was actually in Los Angeles yesterday for an event I had in Los Angeles, so you heard me sort of give this spiel before yesterday, but
I'm fascinated. They'll listen.
It's always funny when you say something, you know that somebody has heard it before. You kind of like say the whole thing again. It sounds weird to do that. But,
Say it again.
Okay. But we had these 4 crises that took place last year are all related to race, obviously. Well, maybe not obvious to everyone, but I thought it was obvious. The COVID pandemic had a disproportionate impact on people of color, and it did from the beginning. African Americans were among the groups most. The group was one of the groups hardest hit by the pandemic from the very beginning. I mentioned yesterday in the context of Los Angeles, because I was in LA, that Velma Moody, who is a sister of Los Angeles Congresswoman Maxine Waters, Velma Moody passed away in St. Louis, Missouri, which is my hometown, in the first few weeks of the COVID pandemic. And she, like every single person who died of COVID in the first few weeks of the pandemic in St. Louis, was African American. That's a huge, staggering statistic, which I didn't know about until I started researching the book. But the idea that every single person, St. Louis is not a majority black city, I don't believe anymore. I think it might have been when I was younger, but I don't think it is right now. But every single person who died of COVID in the first few weeks was black, and that was an important acknowledgement, because it also, in my opinion, reflected the way that society would respond to it. It reflected the way that the former president would respond to it. The idea that it doesn't really affect the good suburban white people, so we don't really have to take it as seriously as we would for some other pandemic or crisis or public health disaster. The second, of course, the economic catastrophe disproportionately impacted African Americans as well, because the black unemployment rate skyrocketed. I mean, unemployment in general skyrocketed, but the black unemployment rate soared into double digits, and still is barely out of double digits in general. And the black unemployment rate has remained more than the white unemployment rate for the entire history that the Labor Department has been collecting this data. In fact, it's almost been double the white unemployment rate for most of the time. And that's, to me, a national shame that we don't ever really seriously address. But it became more problematic and more of a disparity last year. The third, of course, was a racial justice crisis, which was directly focused on African American people. And even though the movement last year was a multiracial one, African American people were the ones who were being targeted. Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and Rayshard Brooks, and black people who were dying, and black deaths were what was sort of motivating this. We also then had a fourth crisis, the crisis of democracy, and that happened because of the racial justice crisis. Donald Trump, there has been sort of a revisionist history, which it happened after I finished writing the book, but I think there's been a revisionist history to say that the Trump administration had nothing to do with, or had no knowledge of, the tear gassing of people, of protesters, Black Lives Matter protesters outside the White House last year. There was some report that was issued earlier this year, I think from the Park Service, which suggested that Donald Trump somehow didn't know about it, or he wasn't aware of it, or he didn't approve it, one of those three. I find that very hard to believe, considering the fact that immediately after they cleared the Lafayette Park across the street from the White House, the president and his crew walked across the park to St. John's Church and held up the Bible upside down to stage a photo op at a church he doesn't even attend. And so I think there was clearly a racial component to this. The fact that what started this crisis of democracy was the president himself being threatened by the Black Lives Matter movement. We saw that we had the young white man, one white boy in Kenosha, Wisconsin, who killed 2 Black Lives Matter protesters. We saw the 2 people in St. Louis, Missouri, the McCloskey couple, who held up guns outside their home to prevent Black Lives Matter protesters from coming too close to their street. They were just walking down the street, and somehow that was a threat to this white couple.
And then they were celebrated.
And they were not only celebrated, they were invited by the president to speak at the Republican National Convention last year. And then after they were convicted, the Republican governor of Missouri pardoned them, and now the male member of the couple is running for office.
Yes.
in Missouri. So there's no consequences. And this is the sad point I make about the insurrection too, that we can't have a society where people can engage in criminal or clearly lawless and dangerous behavior and have no consequences, especially when that behavior is targeted at black and brown people. But then that last point about that fourth crisis is that when we had the election in November of 2020, notice what were the states and cities that were targeted by the former president? Where were the places they originally wanted to go to try to invalidate the votes? Atlanta, Georgia, Detroit, Michigan, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. What do those places all have in common? They're all predominantly black cities. And those were the places where they went. Milwaukee is not a predominantly black city, I don't think, but it is a city that has a larger black population than the nation at large. And so I think that's a reflection of the attempt to invalidate black voices, and it's a reflection of the threat that a lot of white Americans have felt about the rise of this new emerging majority.
I would say that it wasn't an attempt, that it was an attack.
Yeah.
And then, you talked about some of these things that were said and that were done without consequence. My pushback would be, both for the audience and for your readers, that this knowledge and this engagement is an active step. We can't fix what we don't talk about, and you can't talk about what you don't know. And to the degree we've been aware of what's going on, understanding the context and understanding the clear connections to what we were just talking about with race, I think is really important to say. I think it's really important to read. I think it's really important to know, which is why I thought the book did such a good job of laying it out in a way that is easy for people to understand. You don't get to understand the facts, watch the news, and not know what the effect was, what the intended effect was by calling a thing a thing. And that's one of the things that I thought in ways that the book stood out to me by offering that. And I think a lot of readers, I won't say voters, but readers and voters will learn from picking up this book, to me, for people that care about politics, that care about race, that care about social justice. It's all in here to unpack, but in a way that I think is really clear for a broader audience. I wanted to ask you, in terms of talking about solutions, beyond everyone reading this, you talked in the book about America not being able to react to race, which I interpreted as America not being able to fix its race issue because there's been no accountability, or it can't account for its past. Talk to me a little bit about what that means.
Well, I don't think we ever have tried to fix our race issues. We've never even made an attempt. There have been two periods in American history where there was some sort of serious short-term movement toward racial equity or justice. One, of course, was the Reconstruction period after the Civil War, the period basically from 1865 to 1877, when we had a number of laws that were passed. We had the 13th Amendment that was ratified, which ended slavery, the 14th Amendment giving black people citizenship, particularly black men, the 15th Amendment, which gave black men the right to vote. And then we basically have nothing. We had some laws that were passed in the 1860s and 1870s, but those started to be pulled back after 1877, and we basically have nothing then for another 100 years. While we have the rise of the Ku Klux Klan during this time, we have thousands of lynchings during this time, we have black people being run out of their homes and run out of office this time. We have an insurrection. We had an actual insurrection in this country in 1898 in North Carolina. And nobody ever talked about that for a while. We had a series of race massacres in city after city after city. In 1970 in East St. Louis, Illinois, right across the river from my hometown of St. Louis. In 1919, we had the Red Summer of 1919 to 1921. We have, of course, the Tulsa Massacre, which was commemorating the 100th anniversary of. In 1923, we had the Rosewood Massacre, where literally thousands of black people were driven from their homes and killed. And I described, I only focused on one of those incidents in the book, and that was the massacre in East St. Louis, because St. Louis is my hometown. And just the imagery is disgusting to see what people were doing to other human beings. It's tragic that this was actually taking place.
I will say what compounds the tragedy is understanding the connection that you made from understanding our history to what its relevance in the present. Why you have to understand what's happened in the past in order to even know what's happening right now. I don't think that many people do that. I was a history major. I know a whole lot about the past, but it's not a natural process, I think, for people to look back on things that happened 2 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, and tie them to this is why this is happening right now.
which is why we continue to have the same things happening over and over again. Those who do not remember the future, do not remember the past, are condemned to repeat it for the Jewish community. And the truth is, we have been repeating our history. We have repeatedly lived through the same experience. It's almost like a Groundhog Day in America, where we have some racial crisis, and then there's a moment of what we call racial reckoning that follows that. It's very brief, typically, and then we go back doing the same exact thing we were doing before. And there has never been an effort to have full accountability. If you look, for example, in South Africa, after they ended apartheid, Nelson Mandela was released from prison. The African National Congress took over, and they created a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to investigate the crimes of the past, to publicize them, and to atone for them as a nation. We never did that. In fact, even after slavery ended in 1865, when slavery finally ended, we actually gave amnesty to the former Confederate soldiers who fought to defend slavery. We never really held them accountable. And we continue to do these things. Even after this insurrection, people were saying, well, it's not that bad. Maybe we should just move on and let bygones be bygones. This is how we continue to get in the same situation. Why do we have Confederate
Well, not
flags?
every person said that.
What's that?
There are specific groups that said
Well,
that.
yeah, well,
I just want to put a name on
right.
them. I don't want to.
There's a Justice for January 6 people.
Yes.
There's the Fox News crowd and the conservative commentariat who've been pushing that line. But
And I'll add political parties.
and
that
well,
have
of course,
been
the
behind
Republican
that
Party is.
movement.
Well, the Republican Party is interesting too. I have a whole chapter where I talk about the evolution of the Republican Party. Because the Republican Party still tries to pretend that it is the party of Lincoln. Lincoln, of course, was the president who, quote unquote, freed the slaves. But that party disappeared years ago. I mean, what we don't even talk about is it started to disappear in
The values
1877.
disappeared.
Well, the values disappear. The party itself, but there's still a Republican Party, yes, but that Republican Party can no longer claim a connection to that legacy of Lincoln, the social justice legacy of Lincoln, at least. And they started to lose that as early as 1877, which I talk about in the book. So this is not something that just happened because of Donald Trump. This started happening a long time ago, in 1877 with the end of Reconstruction. Then we have a whole long period where I wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post about this last week, about the Republican Party shifting dynamics. And one of the fascinating aspects that was so interesting to me is that 100 years ago, if you look at the Republican Party 100 years ago, the majority of black people were Republicans. And they had been voting Republican for decades at that point. And then a decade later, they were Democrats. So what happened in that period, that 10-year span, basically? And the reason why I mentioned that, and I got really criticized for saying this in the Washington Post, is because the Republican Party didn't deliver. They weren't criticizing me for saying that, but they were criticizing me because I was saying the Democratic Party is on the verge of doing the same thing. And I've been a lifelong Democrat. Obviously, I worked in Democratic administrations, I worked in Democratic campaigns, but the Republican Party in the 1920s had been getting support and votes of black voters since the 1870s. And they had yet to produce any sort of major new laws or constitutional amendments to protect black people from lynching or discrimination in 50 or 60 years. And so black people were starting to feel frustrated. Well, why should we continue to vote for the Republican Party? We've all been Republicans, but they're not doing anything for us now. They're still resting their laurels from the 1860s. We're in the 1920s and 30s now. And I feel like the Democratic Party could easily go that way if the Democratic Party doesn't deliver. The problem, though, in order for that to happen, there has to be a Republican Party then to take advantage of that, which doesn't seem like it's inclined to do right now. But I talk about this from the current perspective, which is that we now have 3 major pieces of legislation in Congress that potentially affect black people that the Democratic Congress, the Democratic President have failed to deliver. One of those is the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. The other is the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And the third is the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act. We have Democrats in control of our government, and the Democrats in control of our government have failed to produce this, even though they would not be in the majority were it not for African American voters. Black voters are the most loyal constituency of the Democratic Party. So one would expect that there would be some sort of reciprocity or at least a return of something. But instead we talk about these sort of generic race-neutral policies that don't affect black people because the Democratic Party of today, even in, not everybody, but the consensus, I think, the moderate wing of the Democratic Party is afraid of doing anything that might alienate middle America, middle-income white people in red states or purple states.
I think that's a really important point, and one that I don't want lost, because I thought it was made really well in the book about the lack of success in terms of your opinion about moving forward with race generalities, without being race specific and without being race intentional. Because I think that's almost defines what the problem has been in the past, both for the Republican Party in the past, in terms of losing that motivation as a reflection of authenticity for communities of color, black people specifically, and the dangers defining what the current democratic status is of running adrift or not concentrating or focusing in the right ways to deliver in ways that speak specifically and intentionally to African Americans in this country.
Well, this is, I think, part of the issue. I consider myself to be a progressive Democrat. And I had this conversation recently with Cenk, I can never remember how to pronounce his name, Cenk Uygur, I think it is. With the TYT, the Young Turks. And we had this discussion, which is on YouTube, about race-specific policies. My belief is that you can't solve problems of racism and racial injustice and racial inequality with race-neutral policies. I mean, yes, I support a higher minimum wage. Yes, I support universal health care. Yes, I support free public colleges. And yes, I support affordable housing. Yes, I support a Green New Deal. None of those things, as much as I support them, will do anything to eliminate the racial disparities in America. They're all good things, but they do nothing at all to address the persistent racial disparity that has existed in our country since the very beginning. And that to me is the central problem. When we talk about these progressive ideas, we don't include the racial component to it. And so I'm disturbed when I hear people suggest that we can solve our racial justice problems with economic populism.
Yeah.
That's not enough. You know, they say a rising tide lifts all boats. I believe that the African American community has, for the majority of our country's existence, lived in a life raft or a canoe. While I know people can object when I say this, but it's not a statement of class as much as a statement of relativity. While the white population, in comparison, has existed in the relative comfort of a cruise ship.
Yeah.
So if one group of people is living in what might be considered a cruise ship, even though not everybody's in the top level of that cruise ship, and another group of people are living on a life raft or a canoe, yes, the rising tide is going to lift all the boats, but it's not going to get the black people out of the canoe and into the cruise ship.
Let me ask you the $64,000 question, because I think that brings us up to this point. Is this the moment now for that race reckoning in terms of action in this country, where it's possible for that to take place? And before you answer, I also want you to roll into that the revelation or the fact that we're still in this country with 74 million people that just recently voted for Donald Trump, with the presumption that those votes translate into an adoptive admission for an approach or a policy perspective that dismisses or is insensitive to the race disparities that have been institutionalized in this country. I know that was real compound, but
So wait, okay,
you're smart, you got it.
All right. Well, I don't believe that we can move forward knowing that we have racial justice issues that are unresolved and expect that somehow the passage of time is going to resolve them. or expect that somehow even the demographic changes will resolve those problems, because time is neutral, as Dr. King said, can be used constructively or destructively. I'm fearful that we may waste this time, that the right-wing, conservative, anti-black faction of America, the people who want to go back and turn back the clock, the people who don't want Muslims and Mexicans and black people and gay and lesbian people or any type of people who are different in our society, different from the norm in our society, those people are angry and ready to fight. And I'm concerned, will there be the same sort of energy in response to that? Or will we just sit back and passively assume that those people will be silenced? When, as you said, 74 million people voted for Donald Trump, and if they weren't racist, they were at least racist adjacent in their willingness to support somebody who was clearly racist.
Yeah, I would argue that they're not ready to fight. They are fighting, and they're fighting with the maintenance of the institution that we built in this society through the courts. They're fighting through their parties with their leaders, elected leaders. They're fighting with policies, and not just old policies, new policies being introduced every single day. Every day that I turn on the news, I hear about a new policy in some state that is an attack that has a race disproportionate effect that is frustrating to me. I'm curious if you think that there is an optimistic approach in reaction to what's happening.
An optimistic approach from whom?
From the audience. From America, from this country. Or do you think that the solution is better posed as there's an optimistic and a pathway for communities of color and allies that understand that a difference has to be made?
Yeah, well, this gives me an opportunity to sort of talk about sort of the last part of the book too, which the solution part of the book. The book is divided into three parts. The first part is about 2020. The second part is about how we got to 2020, and the third part is about how we move forward. What do we do next? And I propose three different solutions to move forward. One is called atonement, which is a responsibility for the white community to atone for the past, to move on and acknowledge the racial history and reconcile that. The second is called accountability, which is a responsibility for African Americans and people of color, which is that we have to hold our leaders accountable, that whether they're black or white, that we have to hold people. I talk about, for example, R. Kelly in the book. I know you're on TV talking about him all day today, but I talk about R. Kelly, I talk about Bill Cosby, I talk about Clarence Thomas, I talk about even Barack Obama.
Good call-outs.
Was that?
They were good call-outs.
Oh, thank you. And I talk about the fact that, I was an Obama supporter. I went to law school with Barack Obama. I've known him for decades and I supported him, but I didn't agree with everything he did, and I would get criticized if I said something, about that. And I think we have to find a way to be able to criticize people and challenge them and push them and hold them accountable, those of us who are black especially, and not feel guilty about doing that. I saw this just last week with the whole Kamala Harris story about the Haitian migrants. I was very critical of that, and I think it's inhumane that we in this country, even in a Democratic administration, have white men on horses with whips who are chasing and attacking black people in Texas, in this country, in 2021. And there's no excuse for that. And I said this, and people who normally agree with me on everything I said, they were very hesitant to agree because they were thinking, well, you don't want to say too much because you might give ammunition to the Republicans, or you might turn off other black people from voting. I'm not telling people not to vote. I'm saying the point of voting isn't just to cast a ballot every 4 years and disappear. It's to hold the people you vote for accountable. If you vote for me for office, and then you don't do anything to make me do the things you want me to do, you've wasted your vote. I'm not saying don't go vote. I think people should vote. We should vote enthusiastically and energetically in every election for every office. But we have to hold those people accountable once we vote for them. That's not a statement of disloyalty to a party or a group. It's a statement of loyalty to your causes, what you believe in. If you support the Green New Deal, if you support universal health care, if you support reparations, whatever it is you support, if you vote for somebody and you think they're going to fight for that cause, and they don't fight for it, then you should demand they fight for it. That's all I'm asking, and I think that we have to learn how to do that, and not in a way that is telling people not to vote, but it's telling people that we have some sort of right, some ownership, because they work for us. If we vote for these people, we can't just, we sometimes we get caught up in tribalism, I think, where we pick a team. I'm on the Democratic team, or I'm on the Republican team, I'm on the progressive team, or I'm on the moderate team. I'm saying, let's be focused instead on the cause that we believe in. Even if the people who are part of your quote-unquote team don't live up to your expectations, hold them accountable and make them live up to your expectations.
I would say that was one of the points that really stood out to me from the book that you talked about. And when you were commenting almost on what we hear, and this is a current conversation on the cancel culture, right? That we're not just talking about music artists. We're not just talking about political figures. We're also talking about political parties. We're also talking about law enforcement. And it's, rather than it being a counterculture or cancel culture, it is a new, more broadly defined definition of accountability, which is what you're saying. That was one of the moments where I sat the book down for a moment to think about it and apply it in other contexts for things that are discussed very currently. And one of the areas that I thought was done really well in the book of explaining, taking a step back to explain how that process is validated of having accountability in the right way. And it's empowering if communities that want change can use the accountability in order to move in the right direction. You also mentioned, I want to talk about this because you mentioned that you alluded to it earlier about some of the criticism, and I get lots of criticism for things that I've said or say, and obviously having the platform and being on television gives you a broad audience to be picked apart, and there's a lot to be expected from that generally. But for me, and you talked about this a little bit, and I want you to talk about it a little bit more, about being called a racist, which I get called too anytime I talk about race at all, especially in the times and in the moments that I'm right. Not that it's an opinion, but these are just facts. This is what happened. And to get the allegation, not just from communities that were on the other side of that position, but also from communities and allies that just didn't understand or don't understand or don't want to understand. How do you process that? Because you do it separate from what's in the book. It's literally what you do on a daily basis, or what I do when we're on talking about these issues that are already heightened with the expectation you're the black one, that you are speaking with a voice that is inclusive of the entire generation. Right. And that is analyzed in ways that lead to criticism.
Right.
Again, very compound.
Right. 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 Well, one of the examples I mentioned in the book was something that took place last year. In November of last year, I went to visit my mom in Texas for Thanksgiving. And while I was there, I saw on the news that the Trump administration had approved a number of executions, federal executions. There were more executions that took place in the last year of the Trump administration than took place in the entire 50, I think, or 60 year span before that. It was staggering. And I made a comment about one particular case that the former president essentially in his Justice Department approved the execution of this man. And I made a comment that I oppose the death penalty in this case. And I had a history of saying that about every instance of the death penalty. I've been opposed to the death penalty for 40 years, actually, at least, because I wrote an article about it in 1981 when I was a high school student. So I know I've been consistent about that issue for years. And simply because I said that, I got attacked for being a racist. And I didn't understand at first, well, how am I being a racist because I said this? well, people were saying I was a racist because, and also I was defending somebody who was a killer, according to them, because I didn't think this person should be executed. I didn't think anybody should be executed. And this person was a black man who killed a black woman. And a lot of people were saying, well, you're basically supporting murder and assault on black women. And I didn't feel that way at all. And the odd part about this, and this is sort of getting to the point you're asking, the odd part about these critiques and attacks were that they were coming from white people. They were coming from white Trump supporters. They're coming from white Trump supporters who had nothing to say about the murder of Breonna Taylor. But they were willing to call me a racist because I was suggesting that nobody should be killed, period. But they didn't consider themselves racist, even though they had no problem with the Attorney General in Kentucky excusing the murder of Breonna Taylor, a black woman. And the hypocrisy to me was what was so staggering and disturbing. And it was the only reason I mentioned this in the book, because I wasn't even planning on talking about this in the book at all. But it was happening while I was finishing up the book. And I was in Texas, and my mom was reading my Twitter feed, and I think 14,000 people responded to that one tweet. And I think I didn't read all of them. I think about 13,900 of them were all attacking me. And I had never done anything like that before in any Twitter post I've ever made before. But I don't know why they chose that one. And it escalated, so they not only went on Twitter and attacked me, but they went on my Instagram, which my Instagram is usually fairly deep political. I just post pictures of myself, not really that place where I expect people to come and attack me. And they did. And then they went to my Facebook, and some people even found my phone number, and I don't know how, and they started calling me on my phone and leaving messages for me. And all because I just said that I didn't think this person should be killed. I don't understand how you call yourselves a pro-life group of people, or you call yourself a Christian nation, so to speak, when you're attacking somebody simply because they're asking for mercy, asking for I'm not asking that he be forgiven, actually. I'm just asking that he not be killed.
Yeah, I would say
Is that such a horrible thing?
It's not, and I would say that goes beyond just the hypocrisy to the cognitive dissonance that I think the folks that were reaching out in that way, that's what it was. I don't even think that if you drill down that they are aware that they are interacting with facts differently because it's coming from you, or it came from your mouthpiece, so that they see it differently, they hear it differently, which is why I like books. These are facts. This is my opinion that I'm putting out there, because you like me get called a racist if I talk about Britney Spears, if I talk about George Floyd. It doesn't matter.
Right.
You get called a racist no matter what. But I would say, just because you brought up, and I thought you did a good job of outlining the death penalty here, I would add that as a fourth lane for changes that could be made at the federal government that would have an enormous impact on communities of color, because there are some states where over 80-something% of their death penalty cases are African Americans. They're just cannon fodder.
No, that's a good point. And one of the other sort of racial components of the death penalty is not just the people who are executed, but the nature of the crimes that warrant the death penalty and end up getting a death penalty. So according to a study that was done decades ago, and this has continued, it was called, I think, the Balda study, the data shows that black people who kill white people are far more likely to be executed, or sentenced to death at least, than black people who kill black people, or white people who kill black people. So it's basically prioritizing white lives. If you die or killed by someone and you're white, then we are more likely to execute you as a society than if you do that in the case with somebody who is murdered is black. And so, how do we justify that? It's like the white women syndrome, the missing white woman syndrome people were talking about recently.
It can't be justified, but we do justify. It is justified, and we.
But the way to do it is to probe, to ask these questions. Why is this happening? For example, I was mentioning the missing white women syndrome. When black women started raising that issue just last week, there was some pushback from some people about this. Well, why are you talking about this? Why are you raising the issue of race shouldn't we be concerned about this?
This individual person.
Exactly. Which no one is saying we shouldn't, but it's also, it gives us a moment to reflect on why are we choosing to focus on this particular case and not the thousands of other cases that are out there. It's about the centering of whiteness. For example, we talk about Black Lives Matter. When we say Black Lives Matter, it doesn't mean that white lives don't matter. It doesn't mean that Asian lives don't matter. It doesn't mean that Native or Indigenous lives don't matter. It just means that Black lives matter. And people sometimes have an issue interpreting and understanding what that means.
I agree. You know, we could do this all day. This is
Yeah,
fascinating to
I'm
me.
sure we have questions too, though.
I want to wrap it up. Let me ask you as a last question before we take questions from the audience. What do you want people to take away from the book? When someone picks this up and they read the book, what do you want them to walk out into the universe with after having read this?
I just want people to think differently about race. Now, a lot of people, I think, already do, and so for that group of people, I want them to think differently about their own experience with race and politics. But for most people, I just want them to think differently about race. And I think that the problem with this, this is an issue that we often come across, you know, about this as well, preaching to the choir, preaching to the converted. How do you get people who aren't already inclined to want to hear about these ideas to pay attention? And I think that the truth is, for white America, there can be no security or safety or sense of true freedom until black people have security and safety and freedom, which is a complex thing for people to understand. But you know, we have people who are storming the Capitol, we have people who are buying up guns like crazy. We have people who they're giving weapons to law enforcement, all because they're trying to protect themselves essentially from black people and brown people. Whereas we could instead redirect our investments.
Openly and actively.
Absolutely. Well, we could instead redirect our investments and resources to making a better, more fairer society, so we don't have to do that. We shouldn't have to spend billions of dollars on police budgets and prisons in this country. But we do so because this is white America's ways to protect itself from black and brown people. And this is the only country that does this. No other country on the planet does that. No other, I mean, we have incarcerated so many people. No other country incarcerates as high a share of its minority population as the United States of America.
Because they can't afford to.
Well, they can't afford to, but they've also not made that choice to do that. It's not saying that other countries are blameless, but our country has made a conscious racist decision to continue to criminalize black and brown behavior instead of dealing with the social justice inequality.
I love all this stuff. This gets me really excited. I love talking about all of these issues. I thought the book was great and fantastic, and I would argue and pose that I felt from reading the book empowered in ways that I didn't feel before, because I felt informed in ways that I didn't feel before. So that to me was the big takeaway from the book that I want readers to have when they pick this up or recommend it to other folks. And you know, this is not just my perspective, because we want to hear from you guys to see if you guys have questions. We can take a few questions. Yeah.
Yes, right down the street, 4 blocks, going towards, you go to the corner, turn left and head towards Japan. You see a street that should be 13th Street, but it's called Funston Street after an imperialist who killed hundreds of thousands of Filipinos. I seldom hear talk of all the American bases, all the American, the fact that Obama would gleefully, an avowed Christian, would gleefully pick out targets for predator drones every Wednesday morning, I think it was. And the weapons also recycle back to this country, as do the people who may become psychotic or may be out in the streets or killed, but yet this whole thing of the way all this money, these trillions of dollars spent on imperialism, which is really a form of racism, there's a large blowback to actually, it really negatively affects civil rights in this country, because there's not the money for social reform that's needed, and there's also it also perpetuates those things, I feel.
How would you say in response to that, how do we interrupt that process or that cycle when we're talking about issues and instances that have been institutionalized?
Well, we have to educate people about the existence of this. I don't know how many people even were familiar with what you were just saying before. And part of the process of change is the process of providing information to educate, which is part of what I try to do with the book, but there are literally dozens of books in here, if not hundreds of books in here, that do something similar to that with respect to different issues or different areas. We live in a society where people don't read, though. And we have to sort of get people to pay attention if they don't read. And I think it's a challenge, but it's an important challenge because there's information out there that needs to be accessible. So I think those of us who have access to the information, we digest it, we process it, and then we present to other people in whatever format we find available to us. It could be speaking to our family members and friends, co-workers and associates. It could be teaching at a local school and talking about those issues in a way that educates people who may not know about those things. It could be spreading the word to younger people so that they can have an opportunity to learn from the history that you have benefited from and I've benefited from. It could be simply communicating in the ways that people are paying attention to. I use, for example, social media as a way to take some of these complex ideas and talk about them. So I think it's just a question of taking that knowledge and disseminating it as widely as possible. It's hard to dispute the facts.
So you worked for CNN. Did you see any of when have you seen some dissemination of this information via CNN, for example?
Well, it's interesting because I work for CNN. I'm not going to say anything on CNN about CNN. But I can say this, that CNN is a business. MSNBC is a business. New York Times is a business. The Washington Post is a business. And businesses operate off of a business model. That business model sometimes involves informing the public about issues that they think the public will be interested in hearing about. And I think there are some issues that are so important that business of telling those stories isn't the most important reason or why we should or should not tell those stories. That some things need to be known, even if they're not things that people want to know. And that's part of the reason why I talk about issues of race. And I don't have control over what other individuals talk about when they're on air or when they have access to a platform. But when I have access to a platform, I try to use my platform to disseminate information I want people to know about, even if it's not information that I'm being asked about. And I'm sure Paul knows about this too. A lot of commentators, you'll see this on television, they push their own agenda. And so the interviewer may ask a question, what do you think about President Biden's infrastructure proposal? And I could answer the question and talk about infrastructure for 5 minutes, or I could use that to talk about why infrastructure is not the most important priority for our country, even though it's an important one when we have other pressing issues, including racial justice and equality, that need to be addressed as well. And we need to be able to do both and do those simultaneously and start talking about those issues and talking about the specific pieces of legislation that might address that and talking about some of the problems that people don't really know about. So it's a question of using your platform and understanding how to use that platform in a way that can educate people.
We have 2 more questions.
My question is, what is your take on the current controversy about teaching in school about critical race theory?
I hope you didn't see me roll my eyes when you said that. It's interesting because I did not expect that. I finished this book, I think, in February of this year.
February.
And I think the critical race theory conversation started around March. So I didn't have a chance to talk about it in this book. But I did talk about critical race theory in the book because I went to law school with, I studied with Professor Derek Bell, who was one of the founders of the critical race theory movement. He was one of my professors in law school. And I talked about him extensively throughout the book. But I didn't expect that immediately after I finished writing the book that there would be a huge controversy about critical race theory. And this is the reason why, and I'm sure Paul knows this as well, but I studied critical race theory in school. I took a course on it at Harvard Law School. I even have a video for my course I posted on my Instagram page. And it's nothing like what people are talking about. It has absolutely nothing to do with what people are talking about. And the reality is, I kind of hesitate to say it, but it's true, is that it doesn't even have a lot to do with what some of the progressives say that it's about. Because critical race theory is a legal theory. It's taught in law schools to lawyers. It's about how lawyers can use the law to protect people of color, particularly African Americans, but protect people of color in a way that manipulates the law in a helpful way. It has nothing to do with all the other things everybody says it has to do with. I'll give you a couple examples of critical race theory application. One, Derek Bell, my professor, he talked about, he wrote a famous article called Serving Two Masters in the Harvard Law Review, which is about Brown versus Board of Education, the famous integration case. And his critique, he was a lawyer for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, by the way, but his critique that the NAACP and other civil rights organizations, black civil rights organizations, were putting the interest of the cause of integration above the interest of the cause of the actual people who were being served, the black people who wanted, they didn't necessarily care about integration, they just wanted their kids to have good schools. They didn't necessarily want the same thing that the NAACP wanted. So he presented a critique about that. That's the kind of thing that he talked about in critical race theory. Another example, Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, who introduced the concept of intersectionality, and she talks about, in one of her famous pieces, she talks about how black women are sometimes sidelined in traditional discrimination law, because we have a lane for race discrimination. So if you're black, you can go and sue because you're discriminated based on your race, and we have a lane for gender discrimination, so you can sue based on gender discrimination if you're a woman, but we don't have a lane for black women or for people who have intersectional identities. So for example, if you're a black woman, you're being discriminated against at your workplace, and the employer says, well, you can't say you're discriminating us because I hired a black person, I hired a woman. Yeah, but you didn't hire a black woman. You have a specific bias against black women, or this particular group.
Tokenism almost.
Well, that's a part of it, but it's also interesting that different groups are affected differently. So you could conceivably have a lesser or no level of bias toward black men, but still have a bias toward black women. And that was something that Kimberly Crenshaw introduced in terms of how lawyers who are pushing these cases and advocating these cases in court could construct an argument to work in a courtroom setting. That's the kind of thing you talk about in critical race theory. Does that sound like anything you've heard anybody talk about? It's these boring minutiae that lawyers talk about. It has nothing to do with anything everybody's talking about. Every time I hear somebody talk about critical race studies and critical race theory, I just roll my eyes, because nobody has any clue what they're talking about. It's so frustrating. It has absolutely nothing to do with anything that's interesting to people that they think that they're talking about. It doesn't even talk about talking about black history. People think, progressives say critical race theory is about studying black history. It's not about that, folks. It's not about that. I mean, that's wonderful. I'm sure most of the critical race theorists believe in studying black history and going back and teaching that, but that's not what critical race theory is about. And so it's just another example of how people take something and they twist it to serve a political agenda.
Twist it into propaganda.
And it becomes a whole controversy that has nothing to do with reality. And so, yes, that's why I was trying not to roll my eyes when the conversation, when that topic comes up. But that's why I'm sorry, it's such a long-winded answer, but I had to sort of say that.
No. We all needed to hear all that. Let me do one more question. I know it's getting late.
So first, I want to say that I'm a big supporter of yours. I follow you, all that stuff, and I'm excited to be here to hear you in person. I would say for the book, I have it audio, and I'm going to purchase a hard copy. I'm on in my second round for it to be audio for me.
Okay, so you said second round?
Second round of listening to it. So I've listened to it the first time.
I haven't even listened to it the whole time. Wow, that's amazing. Wow.
Yes, I have to put it back in because there are some teaching moments for me. So thank you for the book. But I also want to add to that and then ask my question, is that I think this is a book that needs to be taught in school. And it's like replace some of the old dated history books. This is it. If we want to see some change, especially with black and brown children, middle school, high school, this is the book that needs to be in the classrooms, my opinion. And then my question, quite welcome, well worth it. My question is, my timeline is so flooded with the R. Kelly verdict. etc. I just want to see both of you all's opinion on how does predatory acts and the abuse, mental, emotional, and sexual, how does it all play into the bigger picture of the work of systems that we live in?
You've been talking about this all day, so I'll let you go first.
Sure, all day. I think again, and we were talking about it in some of the themes of the book, have more to do with not just R. Kelly specifically, but about new and broader definitions of accountability. Because R. Kelly is significant, and he's been defined as a predator and a criminal. But the bigger issue is the validation that we have with this conviction for little black girls, for little black boys that have known, that we as a community have known for decades that this behavior was going on, and it hasn't been stopped. It's gone through our court system and hasn't been stopped. But today, with this conviction, the conviction stands for a validation, in part driven by the Me Too movement, in part driven by the entertainment and the media that we saw from surviving R. Kelly, but now been validated with this conviction that I think brightens or brings out voices that heretofore weren't believed or valued as much. I don't think we would have gone this far if R. Kelly had been fixated on some other race in terms of whom his victims had been. And that to me is the significance that is also diminishing R. Kelly and speaks more to what's possible now for people that will feel vindicated. You know, there were 45 different witnesses that came forward, 11 victims specifically, 6 of them underage who had interacted with R. Kelly, but the countless others over decades that he's been engaged in this behavior that were afraid to come forward, that didn't want to tell their story, that now may feel like they can, is the significance. That was longer than I want to answer, but that's the significance.
I co-sign on a lot of what you're saying. I'll just add an answer from a different point of view, which is sort of the mental health and societal health impact of this. In that there's an old saying that hurt people, and I don't know what R. Kelly went through to get to the point where he became who he is, but I think there is another lesson to be learned here, which is that we have to rethink who we are as a society. How do we allow this type of behavior, predatory behavior, to continue unchallenged and unanswered for decades? I've heard so many stories of people who said they were abused as children and their parents did nothing about it, or somebody in their family knew about it and didn't believe them or took someone else's word for instead. We have to change that culture. We have to change the culture even of corporal punishment for people, where we feel we're teaching lessons that violence is an acceptable way to punish children for being children. I don't think that we can sort of look at R. Kelly as an aberration and not look at the societal forces that created R. Kelly. I don't think we can look at him and think that he's the only person out there. He just happens to be a very famous person who was convicted today. And I think this is a call to action for the black community, and I think we'd be, not just the black community, but the black community in this case. I think we'd be mistaken to think that we've done our job now that R. Kelly has been convicted and we've sort of addressed this issue. We need to address the issues in our own communities, our own families. And what type of behavior are we kind of giving a wink and nod to in our own families that we're not addressing? We're not talking about cousin so-and-so or uncle so-and-so or even aunt so-and-so who's doing something that we know about, and we let it go. So until we start to hold accountable our own people, we're going to continue to have more problems like this. So that's the reason why I think accountability for everyone is really important, including myself, including other people who we agree with. I feel like I'm not perfect. I make mistakes. I don't think anybody's perfect. But when people make mistakes, they should be held accountable. Accountability, by the way, doesn't mean, I think we should be clear about this, accountability doesn't mean cancel culture. It doesn't mean that the person, in my opinion, at least other people may think differently, it doesn't mean that person is forever banished from society. It means that that person has to take some sort of steps to be held accountable, to be responsible, to apologize for their actions, to go through some sort of process of contrition, and to make amends, some sort of act of restorative justice. but it doesn't mean that we're canceling anybody, in my opinion. It just means that people are being finally asked to do the right thing.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
so
Thank
much.
you all for coming in the rain. I appreciate it very much. I guess I'm going to be signing books or something. I'm going to put my mask on.
Yeah, we're going to put masks on. I think folks that are interested in having their book signed, we have them ready for you. So if you'll just give us a few moments, they're already lined up. Keith is going to make himself available, answer a few more questions, but be able to sign your books. These are great stocking stuffers, so let's get ready for Christmas. And there's lots of schools that need this book too, and they're available right here. So thank you, Green Apple, for having Keith come out here today and hosting us in this beautiful space in the rain. And thank you, Keith, for being here in San Francisco to share your message and coming here.
Well, thank you to Green Apple Books as well. I really appreciate you inviting me out here. And thank you, Paul. I mean, you went above and beyond the Call of Duty. I was so surprised that you actually showed up in Los Angeles today, and now I'm seeing you here in San Francisco. And I really appreciate that. It's very kind of you to participate in leading this discussion today. And on a busy day when you have a lot going on, especially with this R. Kelly case. So thank you for taking time out of your busy day to be here today.
It's an important topic. Honestly, I'm happy to be here to talk about these important ideas with someone that I think is important and has something relevant to say.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you again. I appreciate it. That was really nice. Thank you so much. I'll try it out. Thank you. Yeah. You're very, you know all this stuff.
You heard that?
So Paul,
Yeah.
what is the situation regarding quickly with the SFPD with tasers? Is that still going underway?